A few years ago, this Reddit user moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Melbourne, Australia. It was his first time living on his own. The apartment block had been built in the 1930s. He had been there for a few months when he came home from work one day and went into the bathroom. He saw something strange, a wooden board which had covered a hole in the ceiling that led to the small attic space lay broken in two pieces on the ground. He examined the pieces, which was about an inch thick, and it would have taken Bruce Lee to break it. He thought that the landlord had sent someone to work in the attic. He was frozen stiff with fear. Someone is up there for sure, he thought. He emailed pictures to the landlord asking if anyone had been there, feeling a bit annoyed since he hadn't warned him. The landlord's reply read, "Please call me as soon as you are able to." So he called, and she explained that her last two tenants had said the same thing happened. She promised to replace the board, and about a month later he woke up one night around 4 a.m. with goosebumps all over his body. He said it felt like someone was rubbing their hands on him. Everything was silent, but then he heard dragging and sound coming from above his bed. It was as if someone was pulling a sack of potatoes across the floor, but in the attic. He froze, convinced someone was up there. There's no way an animal could make that sound, or much less that much noise. After 5 minutes, he worked up the courage to turn on the light, armed himself with a cricket bat, and walked to the bathroom. That's when he saw that the new board covering the hole was broken in two. He felt sick, and at this point, the dragging sound had stopped. But he heard something else, whispering. The sound was clear and coming from the attic. It sounded like children's voices, and he could hear one sentence repeated over and over. "It's your turn, it's your turn." He switched on every light in the apartment to make things feel normal. It was 5 a.m. and dark outside, so he tried to watch TV to try and unwind and forget what had just taken place. Then a fuse blew, and his pet Dexter, who he kept in the kitchen, usually never made a sound at night, but he started squawking like he was being strangled. He had never heard him make those sorts of noises, and it was like he was screaming. This is when he grabbed his car keys, ran out, and sat in his car and waited there until the sun came up. When he saw people walking their dogs, this comforted him enough to go back in. The front door was open, but he figured he might have forgotten to close it when he ran out. So he went to the kitchen to check on Dexter, but he wasn't in his cage, and immediately he felt sick again. All the windows were closed, so he looked everywhere inside. When he walked to the bathroom, he heard splashing. Dexter was half drowned in the toilet. He rushed over and took him out, washed him, and dried him while he was trying to calm the poor dog down. He was so confused, and around 8 a.m. called the landlord and gave her an explanation of what happened that night. "Oh, wow, you heard the whispering too," she said. He stayed in the apartment for another 18 months, but only heard the whispering on a few more occasions. He found the board covering the hole in the ceiling 2 more times broken. He lives somewhere else now, but the landlord recently called and said that her new tenants begged to speak with him about some of the stuff that's been going on there. He said, "Forget it, it's their problem now." The boy with no eyes. One night, this Reddit user was 10. He was woken up by his bedroom door opening, followed by someone sitting on his bed. He felt his leg grazed by something and the bed sink under a person's weight. It's just Mom, he thought, and he opened his eyes. It was not his mom. He saw an eyeless boy who had black, empty eye sockets about his age sitting at the foot of his bed. He extended his hand out, and in it was a little box. He was startled, but reached out, but he pulled back. So he reached out again and said, "Give it." Then he blinked, and when he reopened his eyes, the boy was gone. But he could still see the imprint where he'd sat on his bed. Now, fast forward 5 years. His girlfriend came over to do homework, and after she finished, she took a nap while she was waiting for her parents to pick her up. When they arrived, he tried waking her up, and she opened her eyes, suddenly looking up at the corner where the wall met the ceiling. She pointed there and went back to sleep. So he shook her again, and this is when she came to full consciousness, and he explained what she had done. She looked haunted, and up on the wall they saw a little boy with no eyes in a Spider-Man pose staring at him. They both freaked out, and so he told her his story about the same kid. Now fast forward another 5 years. He was with the same girlfriend, and they had a 2-year-old. They were living in his parents' house in his old room. His daughter started waking up at the same time every night, and she'd talk. After a while, he noticed she had almost the same conversation every night. So one day, playfully, he asked her, who she was talking to, and she said, "It's a little boy. He's nice, he's lost, and looking for his mommy." His daughter's nightly conversations continued until they got their own place later that year. The ambulance company that this Reddit user used to work for had a haunted ambulance. A lot of EMTs had stories about it, but never put much thought into paranormal stuff. That is, until they had their own experience with Rig 12. Him and his partner were working in a rural community, and around 3 a.m. it was pitch dark and completely quiet. They were both dozing off, and he was in the driver's seat and she was in the passenger seat. He woke up to a muffled voice and just thought that his partner was talking. He told her he was trying to sleep and closed his eyes. He distinctly heard a male voice say, "Oh my God, am I dying?" followed by a few seconds of heavy breathing. They both sat up straight and looked back into the patient compartment where it sounded like the voice had come from. Things were quiet for a couple seconds. Then they heard the click of an oxygen bottle regulator and a hiss, as if it were leaking. So he turned on the lights and they ran out of the rig. He thought a transient might have climbed in while they were asleep. So they opened the rear doors, but no one was there. He checked the oxygen bottles, but neither was opened. They didn't sleep much after that. One night, this family's daughter went to bed with a bad headache. The next day, she was dead. She had passed away from an aneurysm. After her funeral, the family went to get their minds off the tragedy, and the father asked the uncle, the mom's brother, to check on their pets. The mom and dad went with him. The mother had heard that there was a grand piano and she wanted to play it. After entering the house, the uncle and father headed to the basement to see the animals, and the mother went to the piano on the ground floor. She was playing when she felt something brush her ankles. She thought it must have been a cat that had left the basement and walked past. So she kept playing, and then she felt it again. But she looked under the piano and saw nothing. When she started again, she felt hands clasp her legs tightly. She dashed to the basement door, called her brother and boyfriend, and waited for them. Back outside, her brother could tell she was rattled and asked what was wrong. She told him what had happened, and he turned white. He told her that her daughter, who had died, used to play a game with her father. When he played the piano, she'd crawl underneath, grab his ankles, and push his feet up and down on the pedals. The impish ghost. This Reddit user and their neighbor Diane had a playful poltergeist for years that they called Billy. In their real-life ghost story, they'd come home and find something put in a different place. Milk in a cupboard, toilet paper in the fridge, or even laundry detergent in the bathtub. Diane once called to ask if Billy had been around because she couldn't find her gallon of milk. They finally found it outside on her back steps, and for some reason, every morning her sugar bowl was empty. When she'd had enough, she would point to Diane's home and yell, "Go see Diane!" Within 5 minutes, she'd get a call from her neighbor saying, "Thanks a lot for sending him over here." This occurred for the entire 2 years they lived there. No one believed them, not even their husbands. Her mother even thought that someone was stealing from them while they were asleep. Her sister believed something was going on but didn't know exactly what. Neither of them still can't explain any of it. The Red Lady of Huntington College. Now here's a story that dates back to 1910, but almost any student at Huntington College in Montgomery, Alabama will probably recognize it. That's because the events that led up to it are said to have actually happened. As the story goes, in 1910, a young woman who was new to the school was known for her love of the color red. Sadly, she was also known for being strange and a loner. As the first term got underway, the young woman grew increasingly isolated. Eventually, she took her life by slashing her wrist. Her body was discovered in a red gown drenched in blood. From then on, students and faculty have been reporting sightings of a young woman dressed in all red. She's appeared all around the college campus. The figure, dwelling in complete isolation, is often cited as a reminder of the importance of being kind to one's peers. The Ashley Street Ghost. Huntington College is just one of many haunted colleges in America, each with its own ghost stories. The next true tale comes from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The haunting happened in 1972 at a party hosted by university students living on Ashley Street. A 15-year-old girl who probably had no business being there in the first place suddenly felt a strange, bone-chilling cold, reported by the Michigan Daily. In an attempt to warm up, she went upstairs, and that's when things really went bad, and the walls of the house started moving, and a black shadow approached the girl. Meanwhile, downstairs, posters were simultaneously popping off the walls and falling onto a pile in the floor. The girl wandered back downstairs, where she found herself saying these strange words. The drugs and addiction were her fault, and she accepts responsibility for that, but was not that way deep down inside. She wanted to apologize to everyone involved for what she had done. What made those words even stranger was that the girl did not do drugs, let alone have an addiction. Her words didn't seem all that strange to the students who lived in the house. Before they moved in, the house had been occupied by a man with a very serious addiction. The reason he no longer lived there? He died of a heroin overdose. Has the ghost of Ashley Street made any more appearances? I guess we'd have to ask the people who have lived there. This real-life ghost story concerns a man named Frederick Jordan, who held one of the most lonely and desolate jobs to exist. Jordan was the lighthouse keeper for Penfield Reef Lighthouse off the coast of Fairfield, Connecticut. Built in 1874, the lighthouse was primarily a way of warning ships of a deadly hidden reef, responsible for more than its fair share of harbor accidents. In 1916, Jordan was the head lighthouse keeper, but tragically, he drowned in a boating accident just before Christmas of that year, when he was caught in a storm while rowing home to see his family. Ever since then, the lighting equipment malfunctions, and the lighthouse have been blamed on Jordan's spiritual presence. But even more chilling is that the keepers of the Penfield Reef Lighthouse often find the lighthouse logbook open to the day Jordan died, and locals have recounted witnessing an unidentifiable figure appearing on the water to help lost boats find their way to safety around the reef. This true ghost story might strike you as more welcoming than scary, but only until you consider that we really have no idea our four-legged friends can sense what we cannot. Can dogs see ghosts? Well, there are plenty of dog experts out there, including veterinarians who will attest to the fact that there's lots of documentation that could support the notion that dogs can sense paranormal activity. And then there's the fact that this story came to Reader's Digest directly from a known psychic, Christy Robinette, who had a strong record for using her ghost whispering skills to help detectives solve their cases. A lady named Marlene settled onto her side of the bed and patted Jack's pillow beside her. A year had gone by, but Marlene was still adjusting to the death and loss of her husband. Maybe it was crazy to think that after 40 years of marriage that she could ever adjust. Elmer, the golden retriever, seemed to understand how she was feeling from the very first night. That cold, moonless night when Marlene returned alone from the hospital, Elmer did something he had never done before. He jumped up onto Jack's side of the bed and laid his head on the pillow. Jack would have never allowed it, but Marlene didn't shoo him off. Instead, she just lay down beside Elmer, let the peaceful sound of his snoring lull her to sleep. The next night was the same, and the night after that. Over the past year, it had grown into a comforting routine, but not this night. It was the first time Elmer had left Marlene alone in the bed since Jack's passing. But hearing his nails clicking on the wood floor downstairs, Marlene recognized the sound of Elmer wanting to go outside. So Marlene made her way down the stairs to the foyer, but Elmer wasn't pacing in front of the door. Instead, he was dancing and wagging and wiggling and bowing down just like he used to do when Jack would come home from work. To Marlene, it felt as if Jack had just come home. And Robinette, who is known for her remarkable intuition about these things, believes that indeed that's exactly what happened. The lost colony of Roanoke was one of the first European settlements in the United States. Located on an island off the coast of what is now the state of North Carolina, the colony was established in 1587 under the first Queen Elizabeth. Not long after, the colony's leader, John White, returned to England where the settlers had come from. His trip was meant to be brief, and he was only meant to grab supplies and return to the New World. But political trouble in the form of England's war with Spain prevented him from returning until 1590. It was only 3 years, but a lot had changed when John White returned. In fact, the entire colony, consisting of 115 people, including a newborn baby by the name of Virginia Dare, was gone, just up and vanished. All that was left was a post on which the word Croatian had been carved. Croatian referred to the name of a native tribe that had been good on terms with the settlers. So White thought the colonists had moved to the Croatian island, now known as Hatteras, North Carolina. But they had not, and it remains one of the most famous disappearances that no one can explain. And what's even more interesting is there has never been any evidence to suggest that the colony was massacred. Many believe that baby Virginia grew into a beautiful young woman who eventually fell into a doomed love affair with a native warrior by the name of Okisko. To this day, she haunts the woods in search of her man, often in the form of a white deer, one that always vanishes at dawn. And according to the NCpedia, a state encyclopedia maintained by the North Carolina Government and Heritage Library, longtime residents of the island have no doubt that the identity of the phantom deer is the ghost of Virginia Dare. If you're looking for an explanation as to how an entire colony could just up and disappear, you're not alone. On the positive side, it's one of the handful of mysteries that could possibly be solved in the next decade. The Princes in the Tower. This is the story of two young princes, brothers Edward and Richard, who were imprisoned in the Tower of London to prevent them from becoming king and heir of the kingdom. In April 1483, when King Edward IV died, his oldest son, Edward V, who was just 12 years old, briefly became king. But because of his young age, he had a regent appointed, and that regent was the king's uncle, known as the Duke of Gloucester. This uncle was said to be deeply resentful that the boys even existed. If it weren't for them, he would have been next in line to be king. What happened next is part of the British royal family mysteries. It appears that the young king and his brothers Richard, the Duke of York, were kidnapped and locked away in the Tower of London, after which the Duke of Gloucester declared himself King Richard III. The two young princes were never seen or heard from again, and two small skeletons that were eventually found in the tower are believed to be all that's left of them, other than the ghostly presence. British newspapers have reported from visitors who claim to have seen the ghostly figures. Is it a tabloid propaganda or proof of the paranormal? That's for you to decide. The ghost of the man who was hung. One theme that many ghost stories have in common is that they offer a sense of justice in return for the wrongful death. This particular ghost story, however, offers a somewhat different take. On October 13th, 1877, Robert Schmel was hung after a trial had found him guilty of a terrifying and inexplicable murder spree. The townspeople were filled with so much anger and hatred that they left his body hanging for days. The tale says not one of the townspeople demonstrated even a speck of remorse, let alone forgiveness. Since then, Schmel has been said to haunt the town. Those who have seen him say he appears as a ghostly male figure, but as soon as the figure registers in your mind, it disappears, somewhat maddeningly into the darkness. Thanks for watching.